So, regime stability has to do with, there are certain institutions which are crucial. Contracts which have developed over hundreds of years, centuries, many centuries, that you cannot touch them without consequences. And sometimes that consequence is matched, but in a factor which is very difficult to measure, but is huge, of what you can imagine. What has happened with money in the United States, for example. What was the price of gold in 1970?
35.
35. The price of an ounce now is 900.
Actually, it touched 1,000 today.
Okay. That is telling you something too. So, something is happening. Something has happened with money that is not good, and the temptation is there for government to continue to use money in a way to diffuse the liabilities of the government, which are growing and growing and growing, and many are unfunded. So that's what I like to stress. Regime stability is crucial for the institutional framework and the process of wealth creation. Trying to imagine what would have happened if the United States would have returned to a true gold standard instead of getting out of it in this, after the Second World War is an exercise in futility. But still, it's something that we need to wonder.
Okay, what about Chile in terms of regime stability and turning around from not being very successful to being very successful?
Well, that's a good example, but if you look at Chile in certain areas, it has gone much farther than some developed countries in Europe and the United States. Pensions. They have another problem, which is poverty, but the problem was there before. So even if they have made a lot of progress, they haven't solved it, because there is one way only out of poverty, which is wealth creation. And the way your framework and your culture generates wealth is the only way. You have to encourage people to create wealth. Wealth creation will solve the poverty problem. And of course, depending on the culture, you will have more or less charity, voluntary charity or not. So then you will have to decide whether taxes or not. I prefer the voluntary. But Chile, in the pension reform that happened in 1980, ages ago, they had a problem of any other pay-as-you-go system. Shrinking workforce, people who would cheat because they wouldn't declare their income during their working years, and a growing and aging population. So what they did is they changed the pay-as-you-go system with a blow. They started to pay from the budget the current pensions, and every young person starting at, I think, 40 years old. So if you were 40, you had to start saving. If you were older, you could still have a pension by the old system. If you were 40 or younger, you had to start your own pension account. So people started to declare exactly what they were earning and depositing there. This was mandatory. That's the part I don't like, but certainly solved the problem. And now, people, this is not a problem anymore. People save for their own retirement. In the United States, on the other hand, people have to believe that their children and grandchildren will be there for them to have a pension. if for any reason the United States starts to lag in performance and some people start to emigrate or taxes become higher, then pensions will need to be adjusted with their real value down, either by inflation and not adjusting the benefits, or restricting some benefits. I don't know.
Probably a combination.
A combination probably. For other people, you have the private sector, but private insurance.
Actually, this is where you talked about like every country has its own. See, the problem in the United States is, Bush did try to like restructure pensions and have like a private system, but they have this huge cronyism over there. So it's like, okay, I'm someone who's totally for a private system, but what he was doing is basically then Goldman Sachs gets all the accounts, and that's the big problem. That in Chile you could privatize it without having this,
yes,
political beneficiary.
Yes, in Chile, correct. In Chile, it is now about 15 to 20 companies that compete for the pension account. Some are local, some are banks, international banks, and very soon, I would say in the mid-90s, they started to generate much more money that could be invested in the local market. So they started to diversify abroad. So in a way, it's like the famous sovereign funds. Many Chilean pension funds are investing in Europe, United States, and other bigger markets. Okay. So, I was going to make the questions here. What do you think were the reasons for what happened last year?
Greed. Greed, exactly.
Everybody says greed.
Yep.
And the answer for that is...
I would actually say loose monetary policy.
Correct. Well, we have two, but greed was clearly the favorite. But the question is, what happened in 2008 that greed suddenly became like a H1N1 virus that suddenly hit Wall Street? I would say that greed is like the force of gravity. Flying is defeating the force of gravity, and when a plane crashes, we don't blame the force of gravity. Am I right? Greed is probably the force that I mentioned in that diagram, the force that makes you go for your personal goals, work, save, invest. When that is exaggerated, we say it's greed, or when perhaps you don't like the personal goals of the guy. That's when you say it's greed. If not, it's just the normal ambition to your personal goals. Some people said Wall Street, bankers' greed, a crisis of capitalism itself. The lack of regulation. Whenever I hear that, I really laughed. The banking industry, and whoever works in the banking industry can tell, it's the most regulated industry I've ever known. You cannot even fill a form without exactly doing it in the way the regulators want.
I would even say the point that the regulators have permanent offices inside the banks.
Correct,
so.
correct.
Yeah.
I would go a step further and say it's coerced lending forced on the banks by these little offices, as you described them in the banks, which don't exist, but the regulators are there.
There is something of that. There is something of that.
And
but
that, in effect, forced the old...
I'll tell a story to explain that.
Okay, the old problem of, the amount of money chasing the amount of goods. And what it did is it caused a massive real estate speculation bubble, which had to explode. Not pop, but explode. And now we're seeing that explode.
Why it explode in that market specifically, there is an explanation for that too. But the bubble could have exploded somewhere else. Some say it's a natural characteristic of the economic cycle. I don't agree. There are some errors, but when errors are massive, everybody's making the mistakes.
I actually think there is a bit of that. Like, there was a guy named Kondratiev who came up with this cycle that every 60 years every 60 years you have this massive build-up in...
No, I don't believe that. I think he was simply using data which was biased by credit expansion. the
I don't know, because it's pretty good when you look at it.